I'm very excited about this panel. Top tips from people as to two quite different routes, I think, from Sarah and Leanne as to how they got their permanent positions. And then delighted to have Mark joining us, who's going to talk all about preparing for interviews, which is something that I would like to hear more about because I don't think I interview very well. That was something that we were also talking about in our last panel. Okay, so we're just at about 50 people, so I think we'll just go ahead and get started. You're all very welcome to the second panel of the second day of ECR Day 2022. You're especially welcome if this is your first panel. It's great to have you. I am Alison and I organised the event, but this panel is going to be chaired by Susie. Just to let you know that you are all being recorded. If you would like to tweet about the day or share it on social media, please do. Please make sure to use our hashtag ECRDay 2022. And if you're sharing an image of someone's slide or a picture of their face, for example, will you please tag them and make sure that you cite people accordingly. We will be taking questions at the end, but you can send them through at any time using the Q&A box, which is down below. Please don't use the chat box for questions because they might not get picked up. But if you have any comments, you are welcome to use the chat box. Susie will introduce everyone before they speak. We're starting with Leanne, then we have Sarah, and then we have Mark. So other than that, all I'm going to do now is introduce Susie to you. So Susie is our brilliant chair today, and she is a PhD candidate here at Queen's in history, having previously done an undergraduate degree at Oxford and a master's at Trinity College, Dublin. Her PhD is funded by the Department for the Economy, here in NI, comparatively examines the impact of gender on political imprisonment during the Second World War in Ireland. She is postgraduate representative on the executive committee of the Women's History Association of Ireland. And now I'm going to pass over to Susie. So thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Thank you to all our attendees and panelists for joining us. Our first speaker today is Dr. Leanne Henderson. Leanne is a lecturer in education studies in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work here at Queen's. And her research interests are in the areas of educational trajectories and transitions, language and education policy, educational assessment, and young people's perspectives on education. This follows on from her work as a research fellow in language policy in the School of Arts, English and Languages, where she worked on the project Foreign, Indigenous and Community Languages in the Devolved Regions of the UK, Policy and Practice for Growth. And Leanne has experience as a French teacher and a head of modern languages at post-primary level. Thank you, Leanne.
Thanks very much, Susie. That was a very comprehensive overview. Maybe I'd have given a bit less detail if, I thought it through properly. But anyway, so yes, thank you to Alison and to Susie for inviting me to contribute today. I'm really delighted to be here. What I'm going to do is try and share some, I suppose things that I think were deciding factors in getting my current position. So on paper, what you'll see is a relatively painless trajectory to a permanent academic post. And moving into an academic career was like a career change for me, and I'd sort of actively decided it was the pathway I wanted to follow. So I went from a teaching post to a funded PhD, immediately into an advertised postdoc on a prestigious project, and then I secured a lectureship within 3 years of PhD completion. So seems straightforward. But the parts you don't see on this timeline are the ways the stars aligned to make this trajectory possible. And the truth is that each of these steps were extremely competitive, as is increasingly the rhetoric of success in academic life. But really, I'm very ordinary. I don't have any big grants. I have a modest publication record. I haven't even been to a different institution. I've been at Queen's since my undergraduate degree. So it's relatively difficult for me to isolate the things that set me apart from the next person. Of course, what you don't see here on this timeline are the challenges that I faced in making this series of seemingly simple transitions. So in some ways, the things that have made all the difference to my journey are the snippets of advice that senior colleagues gave me along the way that were probably throwaway comments that they can't even remember. So I was working as a teacher. I'd completed my master's degree and I was interested in doctoral study. I was thinking I would do that part-time, but then I realized that full-time studentships existed. So that was the level of my understanding of the system on entry. I didn't even really understand that someone would pay me to do this degree. So throughout the PhD, I tried to get involved in things that would be good for my CV. A colleague in another institution told me recently about a senior staff member telling her she could put out chairs for a seminar because that would be good for her CV. So you get the idea. So, but I was motivated to improve my profile. And I do think that the additional efforts that I made to become involved in things outside the doctoral project were sort of instrumental later in successful job applications. Now, during the PhD, and especially towards the end, I looked up a lot of information about postdoc funding schemes, but none of them really seemed to fit. And there were these sort of constant messages from every direction about how competitive everything was. And the 12% or 2% success rates were extremely off-putting for me. I sort of thought that I wouldn't be selected for these prestigious opportunities. And this is a key point I want to make throughout this presentation. All of you are competitive, okay? If you haven't realized it already, then you're probably a woman from, a minority background, you're working class, you're first generation. Any number of factors make you more susceptible to believing that these so-called prestigious opportunities are for someone better or more worthy. Now, throughout the 4 years of my PhD, there was one advertised postdoc at Queen's that I was interested in. It was the previous postdoc on the project I ended up working on, but I was nowhere near finished, and my supervisor said, you just have to hold your nerve. Okay, so good advice. Then in the May before I submitted the PhD, the second postdoc was advertised. And I sort of knew I had to go for it. I spent a lot of time working on the application. I just took a week out of editing my PhD draft. It took me a long time because I hadn't applied for any other job because this was the only job. Okay, around the same time, I also applied for a lectureship elsewhere, which was a bit of a stretch and I wasn't really suitable for, and understandably enough, I didn't get. So I came second to an excellent candidate in the postdoc application, and I continued working part-time on a few different projects and submitted the PhD and thought, well, I'll just keep working ad hoc on these projects as best I can. So a few months later, the original candidate who was selected for the postdoc got a lectureship elsewhere and I was offered it. So I actually started that postdoc the week after my viva. Okay, and if you say that to people, they think, oh, wow, but it didn't happen just so easily. Okay, I was working, like 3 jobs at the time. I was prepping for the viva. I was constantly worried about money. But anyway, once I got the postdoc, then I kept looking for jobs because I developed an obsession with looking for jobs. So I applied for another very unsuitable lectureship just very shortly after starting that post, and again, I was unsuccessful. So, but after 3 years working on that project, the perfect job was advertised. Okay, and we'll come back to that later. Okay, so a major factor in securing an academic post is that relatively few posts are advertised, as we've rehearsed quite extensively this morning. And I know you were given a lot of advice about this in some of the panels yesterday, so I'll not labour the point, okay? But my advice is that you look regularly for positions. Keep an eye on the recruitment pages of your preferred institutions, scroll through sites like jobs.ac.uk on a regular basis. If you're actively looking for work, jobs are out there and you will find them. Okay, now they might not be particularly suitable for you, or you have to make decisions on the basis of how flexible you're willing to be. So are you willing or able to work part-time? What about short-term contracts? The biggie is whether you're geographically mobile, because this will increase the jobs that you might deem suitable. Now, I was actively avoiding moving to England, but I knew at some point that could become my only option to continue in this career path. I always checked for jobs there, even though I wasn't really looking for jobs there, because I thought, well, if the absolute dream job comes up, then, you know, I'll have to reassess my priorities here. But I was very flexible on the aspects other than that geographical factor. And you'll see that as we move through here. So throughout my career, I have received quite a lot of unsolicited advice. You'll have to move to England. There are no jobs here. Okay, for advice, but I didn't have to. So I was also told that it was a mistake to take another research assistant role working on a project where I wouldn't be involved in research outputs. Okay, because what I was told was that you've nothing to show for that. I was told that I'd be better to get a retail job and work on my publications to develop my profile. Now, I suppose that was probably well-intentioned, but absolutely terrible advice. Well, yes, this slide is just to remind me to emphasize that if you don't apply for the jobs, then there's no possibility of getting them. So if you see a post that's suitable and you get sort of dragged into, you know, these negative thoughts that someone better than you is going to come along, and you don't apply because you think you won't get it, then you're guaranteeing that you won't get it. You've you know, opted out. You've self-selected someone else to get the job. So sometimes the process of you know, getting an interview sort of seems a bit mystical. But if you meet the criteria for a post and you haven't got an interview, then your application has not made sufficiently clear why you're suitable. If you meet the criteria and you make a good case in your application, you really should be getting those interviews, okay? So the application is the mechanism by which you communicate your suitability for a position. So to get the interview, you have to demonstrate that you've met the advertised criteria. Now, it sounds obvious that if an application is by cover letter and CV, that you should include a cover letter. But I'm shocked by the number of people who don't include a cover letter. And, you know, I'm not sure what's going on. I don't know if the people just aren't familiar with the conventions of the application process. They don't know what to put in the cover letter. You know, I can't really understand, but the cover letter is a requirement and an opportunity for applicants, okay? So the purpose of that letter is that it's your tool to communicate to the panel all the elements of your CV which fulfill the requirements of the post. And I'll show you some examples in a minute. So those requirements aren't a mystery. They're detailed in the job description. Now, the job description will be quite a long document. It'll give you an overview of the role and the duties, but then you'll come to a list of essential and desirable criteria. Applicants are shortlisted according to whether they fulfill the essential criteria, but because there are generally a high number of applications for any of these positions, very often, even at the shortlisting stage, desirable criteria will be considered, right? And there's no real guarantee or order of which of these criteria will be the deciding factor between an interview or not, or an appointment or not, okay? So your job is to do your best to hit all of them, at least in the cover letter, okay? So, oh yes, so when I was applying for the postdoc, I had some more unsolicited advice. That's a long shot. There are bound to be people better suited than you for that job. Well, thank you. Another person gave me the advice that you can hardly get a piece of paper between candidates for any of these jobs. The only thing that sets you apart is being you. Okay, that's the second best advice I've ever had, because the fact is everyone applying who is interviewed meets the criteria, okay? And really at that stage, it's about identifying which of them is the best fit for the post or most suitable, okay? And okay, so applying for the job then. So how do you get an interview? So you'll see things like, you know, normally have, or these are from my own application, normally have or be about to be awarded a PhD in a relevant field, right? So that's a bit of a subjective judgment in any case, okay? you know, what is about to be awarded. So the panel will define that, but we haven't shared that information with you. So you're assessing this criterion and thinking, well, how can I demonstrate I meet it? So I haven't finished yet. You know, the advert says about to be awarded. Well, yeah, that's me. That's me. What's a relevant field? Is it my PhD? Not sure, but you know, I'll try to make a case. So what I saw then were that, oh, sorry, some of my wee markers have moved. So basically it said devolved regions of the UK in the project title, and it talked about policy and practice. So I had those things in my own PhD. So it was about making the most of them. Okay, better get those keywords in somewhere. Now down to the desirable criteria. This one wanted experience in the area of language policy. Now I didn't have loads of experience in this area. My PhD focused a lot on education policy, but it wasn't language policy. But because I'd taken on a part-time research assistant post, I had quite a modest amount of experience in language policy. So, but in the shortlisting panel, if the discussion sort of focused in on this criterion, then I'd made a case that I had experience in the area, okay? So, yes, so this is about making the most of the interview. If you've been invited, as I've said already, the panel has already decided that you have the potential to do the job. Good news. So this is your opportunity to show them why you're the best person, or even the second best person. And you have to remember that you're in competition with all the other people that the panel believe have the potential to do the job. Now, my advice for interviews is to not point to your weaknesses in a negative way. Okay, and I've seen successful job applicants work with their weaknesses. So they tell us, oh, I'm very strong in this aspect, or I prefer to work collaboratively on this aspect because the quality's improved through teamwork, or whatever it is. Saying something like, oh, I don't have much experience in that area. No. Okay. Instead, you say, oh, my current post is a research only contract, reminding them that that's your actual job. But I've undertaken, maybe not but, stop yourself from saying but. I've undertaken teaching in 3 modules. Well, that's been such an enjoyable experience for me. I love sharing my passion for research with enthusiastic students. I'm committed to my own professional development in this area, okay? So, and you haven't said, you know, I have loads of teaching experience, but you have said things that are viewed in a positive light from that aspect, okay? So, moving on from the postdoc then, you can be looking at, you know, another postdoc. I'll not labour this because I know you've been through it in other panels. A lectureship, be it temporary or permanent, an education contract, or a teaching and research contract, and then you can go into some alternative employments as well. So when you're tailoring your answers in the job interview, you should be emphasising the aspects you know are a priority of that job. If you're asked a general question, like what skills and qualities you bring to the role, then the primary focus for a research post will be research skills. Okay, can you deliver on the aims of the project? A teaching or majority teaching role will require teaching skills. Can you deliver the required teaching? Okay, and then a post comprising both elements will require both of those things. Can you contribute to teaching and research? Okay, so saying things like, I don't have much research experience. No, don't you have a PhD? Plenty to talk about, okay? I don't have much teaching experience. No, you can't say that either. Did you give a talk to new master's students? That's teaching. Did you help a more junior PhD student to develop their archival research protocol? Teaching, okay? Find the things you have done and tell the panel about them. Don't emphasize the things you don't have, okay? So these are the criteria for my current post, an exhaustive list of stuff that I needed to cover in my cover letter. Okay, 24 criteria, lovely. Now, in addition to the nicely written cover letter, I took the advice of a colleague to include this table, okay? Now, at the time I thought it was overkill. okay, but should have taken any advice at that point. And having now been involved in a number of recruitment rounds, I see why this type of table is useful. So basically what I have is more than 4 pages, okay, listing each of the criteria and the ways in which I meet them, right down to the final desirable criteria, okay? What you don't know is that at the shortlisting meeting, is, you know, which of these criteria make a difference, okay? So the panel are going down and they're saying, oh, everyone with, you know, 1, 2, 3, okay, everyone there has that. What about 4 and 5? People with 6 and 7 or 8, you know, they're coming into the shortlisting, okay? And they sort of weighed out in stages, okay? So you don't know which one of these things is going to be the deciding factor. So you need to give them the evidence on, you know, for each of them. So, yeah, so basically there's no sense in them scrolling up and down your CV and trying to read descriptions of papers you've written or descriptions of, you know, your doctoral study or whatever, and trying to identify if that's relevant, okay? So things like, oh, is this language policy paper really a good fit for our department? Oh, she sounds a bit too languagey, okay? Tell them how and why the paper is relevant. So when I look back over this application to prepare this talk, it was so cringy, okay? But you have to hold back your inner critic and treat the cover letter as an exercise in persuasive writing. And of course, looking back on all of these things, you think, oh, I could have done that better or whatever, you know? So what you're doing here is you're trying to hit these considerations that people will have for a teaching and research post, okay? Can you contribute to teaching? Okay, yes, I can. Here's how. What about research? Yes, I've done this and I've done this. Are you a good fit? Yes, here's how I'm a good fit with what you've asked for specifically. Okay, and here's something else that's a wee bit of a compliment to what you've asked for. Okay, they want to know, are you refable? So yes, I have this journal article in a quartile 1 journal. I am a safe bet. Okay, and then a key thing they're interested in is whether you have good potential. So what you're trying to show in the application is you have a track record commensurate with your career stage and you have some plans for moving forward. Okay, so advice when I was applying for the lectureship was show them this is the job for you, and also to emphasize your research profile as much as possible, because that would be more of a deciding factor, okay, than any other aspect of the application. My CV when I applied, and I will speed up because I know that Susie's panicking about the time in the background, I'm sure she is. So my CV when I applied for the permanent post was not, you know, the most amazing CV, okay? Before the postdoc, I'd had some like sort of temporary, casual, part-time bits of different work. I really believe that this 3-year postdoc on this major AHRC grant was an absolutely deciding factor. Okay, it was an indicator that I meant business on the research front. But I had had a brilliant mentor during that project who really understood the system and helped me to make strategic decisions about my own development. Okay, and that to me was instrumental more so than, you know, the post itself. When I got the postdoc, my publication record was these 2 reports. Okay. So I did not have 10 journal articles. Okay, I still don't. So, but I was extremely aware moving forward that I needed those journal articles. So when I applied to the lectureship, this is what my publication record looked like. And really at that point, I had 2 publications, okay, because these ones in green are the only ones that really count as publications. Peer-reviewed outputs in high quality outlets. Okay, a journal that's ranked, you know, quartile 1 and has a good reputation. So my publication record was modest, but what it was evidence that I had published, and it was a safe bet that was commensurate with stage of career. Okay, it wasn't the best profile, but it was my profile. So other experience I had, you know, well, that's the list of it. I'm going to move on because I need to finish soon, but I want to tell you one final anecdote for the road, okay? And it's, if someone presents you with an opportunity, don't let it pass you by. Now, that's not to say you have to put out the chairs at a seminar to enhance your CV, but sometimes people will casually mention something that would actually be really useful for your CV, something you don't already have. So, and people often say to you at conferences or meetings, you know, oh, you must come and talk to my students or research group or community group or whatever it is. And I used to politely say, oh, yes, that would be lovely. Right? But I never followed through. And at some point I thought, hang on, you know, why am I not taking these opportunities? So I was sitting in a meeting one day with colleagues in Cambridge who I didn't know particularly well. We were just sort of chatting about our research, making small talk. And someone said, oh, Leanne, that sounds really interesting. You should come and speak to our research group. And I just said, oh, yes, I'd love to. Let's organise a date. And that's how I got invited to talk University of Cambridge on my CV. I stopped allowing the opportunities to pass me by and embraced the serendipity. Okay, so the very, very, very final point is that in many respects, the system is broken, but it is possible to navigate through it. And events like this show that when the system tries to make us compete with each other, that we can resist by supporting each other. So access the supports available to you. You know, the Postdoc Centre has amazing resources. Alison's website has amazing resources. People are happy to share examples of their applications, especially people who've secured permanent posts, okay? Because I have major imposter syndrome. I don't really know the answer to the question of how I managed to secure the post. I know other people with what I perceive to be a far better profile, okay? And a lot of the success is down to timing and luck, okay? So reach out and we're here to help you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Leanne. That was brilliant. Thank you.
I am sorry about my timing, but yes, thank you, Susie.
No, not at all. Not at all. We've plenty of time, so not to worry. That was great. Thank you. So our next speaker this afternoon is Dr. Sarah Sharp, and Sarah is a lecturer in Scottish literature at the University of Aberdeen. She completed her doctoral studies at the University of Edinburgh in 2016 and has since held positions as a Leverhulme visiting postdoctoral researcher at the University of Otago, working within the Centre for Irish and Scottish Studies, and also an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the University College Dublin. And Sarah was also selected for a Fulbright Scottish Studies Scholar Award in 2018 and was based at the University of South Carolina. She joined Aberdeen in 2019 as a lecturer in Scottish literature, working between the departments of English and the Research Institute for Irish and Scottish Studies, where she is the deputy director. Thank you, Sarah.
Hello, so thank you for that very generous introduction. My name is Sarah Sharp. I work at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and I'm just going to briefly talk you through kind of my trajectory to this job and how that all worked out for me. Now, this was originally retro games themed, but I had a crisis of confidence about the fair use policy about half an hour before this talk. So now it just has kind of games font instead. So apologies for that, but otherwise, hopefully it should all be fine. Okay, let's get into it. So I am a fairly normal applicant, I suppose, in lots of ways. I don't know what a normal applicant is actually, but my background is that I came up through a really very normal Scottish state school background, and I went to Edinburgh University, which was fairly local to me, not my local university, but you know, within Scotland, and I completed an MA there in Scottish literature. And at the time, I hadn't really considered going into academia. Since I was a little girl, I'd wanted to write a book. I used to make my mum little folded books and present them to her. They were never finished. I don't know if that's an omen, but I'd always kind of wanted to write a book, but I'd not really seen academia as a possible career for me. And then while I was at Edinburgh, I just discovered I really loved doing research, and I had some really inspiring tutors who were from similar backgrounds, and I thought, why not? Let's keep trying this. So I went on to do an MSc in Victorian literature, which was mostly self-funded. I was a research assistant during that time, and I also worked in tourist retail to get through that particular phase. And I had a very small performance-based bursary from my results in my 4th year of my undergraduate degree. And then I proceeded on, was very lucky and had a funded PhD still at Edinburgh. So that was kind of how I came to the end of my doctoral studies. And at the end of my doctoral studies, I was keen to stay in the field. I was keen to continue my research. I felt I'd kind of started things I wanted to continue. And I went on to 2 postdocs and then 1 Fulbright scholarship. So my first postdoc was in New Zealand as a Leverhulme Study Abroad studentship. I then proceeded on to an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellowship at University College Dublin. And during that time, I froze my postdoctoral fellowship for 6 months to undertake a Fulbright Scottish Studies scholarship in South Carolina. And after I completed these postdocs, I was really fortunate and was appointed a lecturer in Scottish literature at the University of Aberdeen and a deputy director at the Research Institute for Irish and Scottish Studies. Now, please note, this is very much the swan above the water version of this story. So this looks very smooth, very simple, 3 years of postdocs and then on to the next thing. But what follows and what I want to talk about today is kind of the way that my wee legs were kicking underneath the water. So what happened, how I got there, and some case studies of things I applied for in that interim space. While we're here confessing all our faults, I also just want to admit that this photo is not my graduation and not my graduation hat. You don't get a graduation hat at Scottish universities, but I had to wait till I had a postdoc to get to steal someone's hat. So anyway, with those lies revealed, let's continue. So what are the rules of the game when it comes to searching for your lectureship? I wouldn't say I'm comfortable saying that there are particular rules. I don't think there are hard and fast things you can do that guarantee. I think most people applying for lectureships are doing the right things. It's also a very rapidly changing and often quite opaque system. And that's why I really appreciate sessions like this session today that Alison has organized, because they don't need to be opaque. The process can be more transparent. And I think it's really helpful that we're beginning to talk more openly about these things. So I also just want to emphasize that I'm highly aware of the importance of positionality in all of this. In deciding which doors are open and closed for us, in deciding how long we're on the jobs market. And this can be all kinds of things. So your gender, your race, your socioeconomic background, your age, the university you did your previous degree in. So what I would say as a caveat before I start talking about my own kind of career is that some doors that are open for me might not be the doors for you. And equally, some doors might be closed to me that might be very, very useful to you. I'm coming into this with things that are privileges and things that are kind of roadblocks, and I'm very aware of that. I think it's also important to know that success is going to look different for different people. What I want in a job might not be what you want in a job. And the important thing is kind of finding a role and employer that works for you. So with all of that kind of mentioned, I am going to talk about some case studies of jobs that I applied for during my kind of postdoc years and what I learned from them. So hopefully that will be helpful. Oh, that doesn't work. What button do I need to press? This one. Okay, so this is a horrifying slide showing my jobs board from New Zealand, and my partner described it as looking like something out of a horror movie this morning, which was really bolstering. So during my postdoctoral years, I was kind of in a constant process of applying for work. So because all of my roles were temporary, it was important to me to keep applying. And I began with a fairly scattergun approach. I was applying for a whole range of different things that I thought I might be able to do. And then as I proceeded on, I became increasingly focused on roles where I felt I had a stronger fit. So I became increasingly aware of the type of jobs where I was getting interest, where people might be calling me to interview or contacting me, and the jobs where I just really was getting a very quick no thank you. And that helped me to decide where to put my energy as I got busier. What is important to note is that we all have our own unique set of motivating and limiting factors, and it's good to think about those going in and to keep reassessing those as you go through the process. So for me, at the beginning of my kind of postdoctoral journey, I'd been at Edinburgh for quite a long time, and I worked alongside lots of academics who'd had lots of international experience, and I didn't really have any strong ties. I had ties in Scotland, but I didn't have anybody really relying on me at that time to be in Scotland. So it seemed like a really good opportunity to get some of that experience that I slightly envied that other people had. As the years went by, a whole load of motivating factors appeared for trying to get closer to home, trying to move back towards working in Scotland. So at different points, I had different things. The other thing that kind of limited me was that I'm from a fairly rural area of Scotland, where it would be very difficult for me to move back there and travel to work at a university. So I was aware that my contract, and I couldn't really afford to move somewhere on a lower contract for various reasons. So it was clear to me that I needed to be looking at full-time roles, or as close to full-time as I could, to be able to kind of support myself effectively. So that was a limiting factor for me, but for somebody else, that might have been something that fit them better. So basically, it's a really good idea to think about these things. And the way to think about it is as needs, wants, and nice to have. What are the things that are absolutely essential for you to be able to continue on with your life at a sort of standard that you would be happy with? What are the things you want to make you happy and to make sure that you're kind of moving towards the goals that you have for yourself? And what are the things that are nice to have? What are the things that make your life just a little bit better? And I think keeping those three things in mind are really helpful, because they can help you to kind of weed out what you want to apply for and what's just not worth your time. Okay, so let's go through some case studies. So the first case study I wanted to talk about was something that I applied for throughout my postdocs, which is very general calls for applicants. So that might be jobs that are titled lecturer in literary studies or liberal arts. That might be kind of general postdoc funding schemes, unspecified kind of teaching fellow posts, and of course, the ubiquitous JRF at Cambridge and Oxford. Now, I've applied for a whole range of these different roles, and I've had success and failures with these, as my CV suggests. However, I probably could have been a bit more strategic about how I approached them during my early career, when I put a lot of energy sometimes into postdocs that I just didn't know anything about, really. So what I would say is, if you see a job that is very, very open, that has a lot of different ways that it could be interpreted or could cover a lot of different disciplines, the first thing I would suggest you think about is, do you know anyone who's had that role or a similar role? And how similar or different is their profile and experience to yours? That can be really helpful, because it can help you gauge whether you have enough experience to get one of these roles. But it can also let you know there might be somebody you could speak to about what that role is and what you might do to be competitive for that job. So my second point comes into this: can you access an example application for one of these jobs? Do you know somebody well enough that you could say to them, could I have a wee look at your application, or would you be happy talking to me about your application? Equally, lots of careers services have examples as well. And similarly, is there anyone you can contact with questions about this job? Now, if you don't have access to any of this, it's a good idea to look at your odds of getting this work. A lot of these big kind of fellowship schemes will have numbers online, and that can be helpful in just sort of managing your expectations. And how much time do you want to invest in this? If you have no idea what your odds are, it may still be a really good idea to apply, because you've got to be in it to win it, obviously. But if you've got lots of different applications at the same time, and there's something that is more suited to you, then maybe that very open JRF isn't the one to put all your energy into. Maybe you just have a wee go, and then you proceed on to the thing where you've got a higher chance of success. These are just my kind of interpretations of these, and I'm sure there are people who've had different experiences, but that would be the questions I would ask for one of these roles. Okay, so lectureships right out of PhD, the fairy tale, the dream, the thing your mum goes, oh, why don't you just apply for that? I'm sure you'll get it. So when a permanent lectureship in your exact field comes up right as you finish your PhD or in the last months before you hand in, it's really tempting to apply. And I certainly did that. I applied for a permanent lectureship at, I think, Cork in the first months of my postdoc. And I wasn't successful with that because I really didn't have the experience for it. But I did learn quite a lot, and I don't think it's an absolute no-go to apply for these jobs. What I would suggest you do if this happens is you talk to a trusted mentor and possibly any contact person listed in the advertisement about your competitiveness before you expend a large amount of energy on this. So just double check with somebody, is it worth me having a go at this? Because they might say no. And in that case, there'll be other things that you can put your energy towards, or they might say, yeah, why not? And then you can have a really good go. I'd also say don't be downhearted if this doesn't come through. You're probably up against people who have taught quite a bit before or who have got quite a lot of research experience, and that's okay. You're building up expertise, you're building up your learning about applying for things. The next one I wanted to talk about is out of field roles. So I had noticed around me some colleagues, some peers who had applied for jobs outside of their kind of original fields. So, you know, moving over from English literary studies into other humanities disciplines very often, or into kind of very specific subfields. And with this in mind, I ended up applying for a medical history role back in Scotland because I was keen to move back to Scotland at a certain point. And at the time, my disciplinary fit wasn't quite sufficient. So I had been encouraged to apply, but in the end, somebody who could teach kind of more general history modules came up, and a decision was made that that was a better fit. What I would say from this experience that I learned is contact the named contact on the advertisement in advance and just check that they'd be interested to hear from somebody outside discipline. Also, it makes sense to only apply for these if you have been developing a track record with that second string. And it's a good idea to do that if you think you might want to move over. So looking for opportunities to present potentially to medical humanities events or to give papers that have got a medical humanities slant, looking for opportunities to get involved in teaching potentially within those disciplines, anything that's going to show that you do have some expertise and you're not just kind of doing it on spec. A really helpful thing I learned from this one, which Leanne has already mentioned, is that you really need to write a cover letter. This particular job, they didn't say they wanted a cover letter, so I just didn't write one. And when I got my feedback, they very kindly said to me, you really need a cover letter. You can't just kind of throw your CV to the wind there and answer a couple of questions, give us a cover letter. So that was a really important lesson. The home university. So very often there will come a point where you're applying back either to your PhD institution or to the institution that you currently work at. And this can be really emotionally fraught, like big solidarity to anyone doing that at the moment. I did this several times over my postdoctoral career for institutions I'd previously worked at or studied at. And there were a few things I learned from this process. So different universities have different approaches to former PhDs and postdocs. So some universities, you will see lots of people who've previously studied or worked at that university returning, other universities less so, and it can be hard to predict. It's important to understand that although this process feels really personal, you know, but they know me, why are they not interested in me? Really hurtful. The decision is very rarely just about you or you not meeting the criteria. It's very often got to do with what a department is looking for and who has applied for the job. So you can't really predict who's going to have applied and how much experience they have. And you also don't necessarily know where the strains are within a particular institution, what colleagues have argued they really, really need as a sub-discipline, things like that. So very often it really has to do with just how a department is thinking about its needs at a particular time, and very little to do with your CV if you've met all the essential and desirable criteria. One thing I would say is that it makes sense to try to talk to somebody from the department beforehand. This can be useful in giving you a kind of a little bit of inside intel potentially about what the department needs at the moment. But it can also just help to manage your expectations. You know, it can be useful to get a wee bit of a lead on the level of seniority that they're expecting to hire at, etc. Afterwards, always ask for your official feedback if you can, but it can also be really helpful to then process that feedback with a trusted mentor or colleague, somebody who can talk to you about what that feedback means, and just help you to kind of work that stuff through. Yeah, international applications. So applying into different university systems can expand the opportunities that are available to you. And I applied internationally throughout my postdoctoral career because Scottish studies is quite a small field and is more prevalent in some countries than others. So there are countries where I have very little success when I apply for kind of general roles because my slant, the thing that I've worked on throughout my career has been pretty Scotland focused, and they're not necessarily departments where it's part of kind of the research culture. And equally, there are other departments where it's a really big part of the research culture or where they're wanting to grow that. So it made sense for me to sort of apply quite broadly. The things I learned from this is, and this is maybe obvious to other people, but different academic systems can be very different indeed. So a university in another country may be looking for a very different set of documents or have different expectations of what is included in some documents. And they may use a different type of application system. And the really classic example of this is if you're trying to move between the USA and the UK, because your references need to be different, you're very often having to produce teaching sort of motivation statements and things like that. So take your time to research this. Try and factor in the time for this if you're thinking about expanding your search. A really good thing to do, if you know someone who works in the country you're interested in, try and have a conversation with them. They're often the best informal source of information and can sort of weed the myths on the internet out from the realities. The other key thing to think about is what are the visa rules for that country that you're applying into, and what is the university you're going to's policy on international hires? Will they support you in applying for your visa, basically? And how difficult will it be to get that visa? For example, if you're applying for jobs in Canada, a lot of jobs in Canada, if there is a qualified candidate, Canadian candidate, and you are an international candidate, the Canadian candidate will legally have precedence. So it's important to know that just so that you can decide whether to apply in these circumstances. Okay, and last but not least, the repeat applications. So if a university has rejected me recently and another role comes up, should I apply again? And this always feels a bit uncomfortable. You just think, oh no, not again. Oh, I did this a few times across my postdoctoral career with kind of mixed results, but eventually this is how I actually got my job. So a Victorian literature role came up at Aberdeen and I wasn't shortlisted. A few months later, a role in Scottish literature popped up. I had a chat about this with my mentor and we decided it was worth me applying. And very luckily for me, the fit was much, much better for that particular role and I was eventually hired. What did I discover from this? Don't be discouraged or embarrassed to try again. If you think you fit a role and can thrive in a department, it's often worth persisting. But you must make sure that you've taken on board any useful feedback that they've given you and you're not just kind of throwing the same application at them. But this can be, a useful thing to do. Okay, so those are kind of the case studies I wanted to talk about. And I thought I'd just talk about what I do when I see a job that suits me. So the first thing you really need to do is read your advertisement really carefully and ensure that you meet the required attributes using your current CV. So not you're nearly there, you definitely have the required attributes. If that is the case, I would tend to contact my mentor and ask to discuss the role with them. From there, I would work on tailoring my CV to ensure that my relevant expertise and interests are really foregrounded and that everything is up to date. And from there, with all that information fresh in my head, I develop my cover letter and any requested documents. And I try and do that fresh each time wherever possible so that I'm really addressing the specific role. Make sure that any references you need are on board and understand the timescales. Some jobs, they're going to ask for the references beforehand. Some of them are going to ask after interview, but you want your references to be ready to big you up and to understand what the job is. Meanwhile, with this, if I have friends or contacts with that funding or at that institution, it can be a good time to approach them and say, hey, could you tell me a bit more about this? If I'm currently at an institution with a careers service or have an advisor who has offered to read application documents, I might ask if they can help me with that. But if the timescale is tight, you can't really expect folk to do this for you. This is, a kind of a nice to have. You just have to hope that you can get a bit of feedback. And I'll often contact the person who's listed in the advert as the contact at the institution, but only if I have a legitimate question to ask them, not just for a blether, they're busy too. After I've done all this, hopefully I've got a developed application. I'll do a last copy edit, and then I'll submit it and hope for the best. So when I got my lectureship, this is what my CV looked like. I had 2 postdoctoral fellowships under my belt. I'd been on my Fulbright fellowship. I had a record of smaller funding with groups and by myself. I had 4 articles in journals and 1 book chapter, and my book was under review and just about to go under contract with a university press. So just to say, my book wasn't out at this point. There was just the potential. It was clearly going to come under contract fairly soon. I had teaching experience at all levels, including module design and supervision experience. And for this particular job, I had specific relevant experience in an area studies research institute. And this ended up being pretty essential in clinching the deal. I don't know why I keep pressing that button when I know it doesn't work. So this is the person specification that Leanne was talking about that you get for every job. And this is the one for the job that I eventually got. So what I would say is that having now sat in on selection panels a few times, everything in that essential criteria box, you do need to hit it, or as close to hit it as possible. When people are asked to review your application, they will be asked, does the person meet all the essential criteria, yes or no? So you want it to be so crystal clear that you have these things. You then look down the desirable list and you see if you hit all of them, or as many as possible, and how you can foreground the ways that you could potentially hit the ones that you don't have. So for example, for me, I couldn't have fellowship at the UK Higher Education Academy because I'd been working abroad, but I addressed that nice and clearly, that I had the accreditation equivalent from the country I was working in, Ireland at the time, and that I was happy to undertake HEA accreditation if they wanted me to. So work your way down, check that, everything's good, you're good to apply. The next thing you need to do is look at the job description and start kind of trying to, I guess, read the university's mind a little bit. So this is me doing that. This is the job description. And I'm looking for things that aren't in the essential or required, the essential or desirable characteristics, but that might give me clues about the type of thing the university is interested in, that I might be able to address. So I noticed that post-colonial and transnational approaches are up front on that description. And at the time I'm working in diaspora studies, these are frameworks I've been using. So I think, great, those are the things that I'm going to really, really target. I look down, it talks about contributing to a research institute of Irish and Scottish studies. I've just done that in New Zealand. I think, right, I'm really going to emphasize that because that's a really good piece of, shared interest there. And then I look down and they're talking about external funding opportunities, and that's something I've got a fair bit of experience with at this point. So I think, right, these are the key things that I want to emphasize across all of my documents. And then in my job talk, this is kind of the argument I'm going to make for myself across it. So it's a really good idea to just get out your highlighters and go through all of those job documents and try and work out what are the key things that you can talk to that they may be interested in. So just to sort of draw to a close, the things that helped me to get through this process, the things that made sure that I sort of was able to cope with some of the difficulties of this process were, number one, building really good relationships with chosen mentors. Now, I'm aware that just being assigned a mentor who's excellent is kind of a piece of luck in some ways. I was really fortunate that my PhD supervisor was very good at pointing out people who might be good mentors for me, suggesting that I applied for funding with them in the first instance, and she was somebody I could come back to and ask about mentors further on. And I was just lucky. But if you have a mentor who is less helpful, that doesn't mean you can't have great mentors. You just need to choose them. So don't be afraid to approach people and say, hey, I really like what you're doing. Would you be able to chat to me about this or that? And very often people in your department will help you. So looking to build that kind of mentor network and talking to them about the things you're doing. The other thing I did was I looked really carefully at the trajectories of similar scholars ahead of me. So Scottish studies is a fairly small field. I looked at a few people who had done things like me and then had stayed within the industry, and I looked at the kind of choices they were making and used that to kind of guide me a little bit. As I began to apply, I noted trends in my own application results, and I used that to decide where to expend my energy and which goals to set for myself. So what is realistic? Which institutions does it make sense for me to apply to? Where am I getting nowhere? What kind of roles do I just not have the kind of experience I need for? What kind of roles can I realistically be interested in? And I think it's really important to emphasize here, you can't be good at everything. I think the jobs market makes you think that you can and you should, but that's not true. Everybody has particular areas of strength. You need to find out what those areas of strength are and then use that to guide yourself as you move through the application process. Other things I did, I would review my CV and then ask for opportunities that would help me reach my goals. So I was on research-only contracts for a lot of this journey. But I was aware that if I wanted to go back to Scotland and have a teaching and research role, then my teaching CV needed to stay up to date. So I would very often, particularly when I was at bigger institutions, it was important that I sort of made myself annoying and appeared and said, hey, I really need teaching experience. I'd really love to supervise somebody. I'd really like to be part of a group that designs a module. You know, keep putting yourself forward and asking for opportunities where you have time. Also setting boundaries and trying to maintain a strong sense of your own limits, needs and wants. So what are the things that you can compromise on and what are the things where actually that's not for you? For me, I always had in the back of my head, well, I've worked in retail before. If I am sort of working an incredible amount for less money than I would be making in retail, I need to reassess what I'm doing. I need to think carefully about whether I want to continue. And that was something I sort of held in my head to help me make decisions so that I wasn't just accepting not being treated appropriately by universities. And everyone will have their own boundaries, but it's important to just know those in your mind. How far can I go here? What is okay and what's not okay? Another thing I did, I tried to be aware of departments where I could be a good fit and just keep an eye on what was happening there. Who had they employed recently? Who's working there? What's happening? Have I been to conference there recently? I just tried to keep an eye on that because that means that you're still sort of in that kind of orbit and you know what's going on and you can write an application easily for them. And then thinking about a plan B and taking tangible steps towards it wherever you can do that. So for example, at UCD, I did a QQI in project management because I knew that I already had all this project experience. I'd seen that there were some really interesting jobs in kind of research project management. And I thought, well, if this isn't going to work out for me, that would be something I'd enjoy. That would be something I could do. I like working with people. I like projects. And I started building up expertise so that I could move if I needed to. So these are kind of the things that helped me. I'm very aware that everybody has their own specific journey towards a job, but I hope it's maybe helpful hearing what I did. So with that in mind, thank you so much for your attention and I'll pass on to Mark.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was, again, really informative and really interesting. And thanks for being so generous with all your insights. Our next speaker is Professor Mark Fonten Burnett, who is a Professor of Renaissance Studies at Queen's, and he is the author of Masters and Servants in English Renaissance Drama and Culture, Authority and Obedience, Constructing Monsters in Shakespearean Drama and Early Modern Culture, Filming Shakespeare in the Global Marketplace, Shakespeare and World Cinema, and Hamlet and World Cinema. And his new co-edited collection, Women and Indian Shakespeares, will be published by Bloomsbury Academic this June. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Susie, for that generous introduction and for chairing today. And thank you to Alison for the invitation to be with you. It's a pleasure to be participating. So I'm Mark Fonten Burnett. I'm a specialist in English literary studies, specifically Shakespeare and early modern literature. I still specialize in those areas, but more recently, I combined that with global Shakespeare's afterlives and adaptation studies. I've taught at Queen's for 33 years. I've been on numerous job panels. I've had a number of grants. I've worked actively with postdocs as mentor, and I am a series editor. Echoing Sarah and Leanne, what I'm going to say is not prescriptive It's suggestive only based on my own experience and what has worked for me. Everyone will have a unique approach particular to them, so please bear that in mind. So looking for an academic position, as Leanne has said, do look at jobs.ac.uk, do look at the Times Higher. If you're interested in jobs in the US, look at the Chronicle of Higher Education. You might also, if you're interested in jobs in the US, look at the MLA job list. That's the Modern Language Association of America job list. You can get alerts. Do get into the habit of looking regularly at all job lists. You might even write to the universities themselves on the off chance that a position might be available in a particular part of the world. When should you apply? Well, when the thesis is either submitted or vivaed, not before, unless not in possession of a PhD is specified in the advertisement. And that means that despite all the pressures that are on ECRs today, the thesis needs to take priority over the acquisition of other kinds of experience because, as has been said, it's impossible to multitask everything. My own experience, when did I apply for this particular position, which was a lectureship in Shakespeare and early modern literature here at Queen's, advertised in 1989. My goodness, it's a long time ago. Well, for me, I didn't actually think about location, although I absolutely recognize that's a powerful consideration. I only thought about the subject area within the discipline and acted accordingly. And when I was on the job market, I only applied for those positions, A, within my field, and B, for which I thought I had a decent chance of being shortlisted. Actually, I'm not really sure if my own experience is compatible with what is increasingly expected of job seekers today. It was, as I'm saying, a long time ago, and the market, what's expected of candidates is very different now to what it was then. However, having said that, at the time of that application to Queen's for this lectureship in Shakespeare Early Modern Literature, I did have published journal articles, teaching experience at various institutions, international conferences, a temporary position as an assistant at the University of Geneva, Switzerland, an additional research assistant position on an early modern edition project. And I was able to speak to those things at interview. The expectation indeed was that I would do so. I didn't have any funding as such, apart from a PhD award, but I had investigated the funding bodies, such as what is now the HRC, and themes before being called for interview. And I had an answer to hand. I had a few ideas. And I think all of the above was being looked for as part of that appointment. Echoing Sarah, don't apply for everything, be strategic, be focused. This is because if you apply for a post that's not in your field of specialism, it's not necessarily likely that you'd be shortlisted. My sense is, again, speaking from my own experience, only apply for positions where there's an evident match between what you do and what the institution is looking for. Why is it advisable to do this? Well, because you could be spending your time finishing your thesis or planning your first publication or getting some other kind of valuable experience. Have your referees ready to hand when you're thinking about job applications. That means contacting them in advance. Do ask your mentors, supervisors, if they're willing to write in this capacity, and do alert them well in advance of any requested or anticipated deadlines. So the application letter, as Leanne's very helpfully reminded us, the application letter and the CV. So the application letter, make your experience work for you. Do list and reflect on your research, teaching, and any service experience. In addition, have a think about how anything outside of the academy, the academy makes you a desirable prospect for an employer. Above all, keep coming back to the job specification and the criteria. Try to show in your letter, A, how you meet the criteria, and B, a sense of passion and excitement, your enthusiasm for the position, the upbeat, positive notes. And use your support network. Work with your supervisors, mentors on the application. Do they have any advice for you? You could combine this question to them with your request for asking if they would be willing to serve as a referee, if need be. The thinking and the preparation that might form part of your application letter. Do investigate, as far as you can, the institution to which you are applying. Is it possible for you to look at in advance the teaching provision in your area? The research culture will be more evident and visible. If information about teaching and the curriculum is available, how far can you present yourself as filling a gap and complementing and enhancing that provision? Does the institution have a mission statement? Might be helpful to think about. Beyond the particular school or department, the university as a wider entity. Where's it going? What's it hoping to achieve? How might your profile be part of that? If you're called for interview, what to do? So I'm slightly going off script here, but I think that this might be a moment to kind of concatenate some of our thinking. If you're called for an interview, what to do? Well, give yourself good time to prepare, rehearse, and practice. Film yourself on your phone, MS Teams, Zoom. When I first came to Queen's, I was filmed as part of a training program. I gave a short talk and it was very instructive. Do I really wave my hands around like that when I'm talking unnecessarily? Yes, from this short film experience, I did. So I adjusted the gesture. Ask a friend or a colleague to listen to your presentation. Ask a friend or a colleague to give you a mock interview and pitch an imaginary left of center question to you, such as in my field, why should I read Shakespeare? Or, how is Shakespeare relevant to me today? The night before, again, speaking from personal experience, don't necessarily rehearse. Take some time off. Relax. If you are called for interview, when you enter the interview room, so I'm assuming that we will be returning to face-to-face interviews in real time in the future, be prepared to be surprised. There could be any number of people in the room from within the subject area or from across the university. It might be 2, it might be 10. It could be a small room. It could be a big room. Be prepared to be surprised. In the interview itself, again, just from my own experience, if you've been asked to give a presentation, A, keep to time, where rehearsal practice comes in, and B, do utilize whatever knowledge you've been able to gain about that subject area's teaching provision, and C, try to reference the research culture you might be joining. The presentation, do try and combine the general and the particular. Do give examples, particularly arresting and lively ones. More generally, over and above the presentation, keep your answers to the point, not too short, not too long. It's okay, in my view, to come back to a questioner to ask for clarification. Do listen to the question. What is it that's being asked? Don't leap in with an answer if you're not sure about it. Take a moment to take stock, because you're the one who's in control, although it might not feel like it. Be prepared, if asked, to be able to pitch your research and what you do and who you are in an accessible way. Be prepared to talk as much to non-specialists as to specialists. Can you describe your research on the back of an envelope, i.e. in a pithy and pitch-like way to a non-specialist audience. And take a moment before the interview to think about if you have any questions. Sometimes at the end of an interview, the candidate will be asked if there's anything they would like to ask. Be ready with whatever might be important for you at that point. And throughout, keep all of your audience in mind and involved, although there will be parts of an interview where you're concentrating on one person alone. Afterwards, and feedback, if you're not successful in the interview. Feedback on a performance in an interview is sometimes given and can be asked for. It's usually communicated through HR or personnel. So do take advantage of that and have a think about it if you can. It might help, as has been said, to fill gaps, refine a direction, and enable a plan for future activity. If appointed, now, Alison asked if I could reflect on this question. I'm very happy to do that. If appointed, how do you approach balancing a heavy teaching load and advancing the research? Well, for me, in 3 ways. 1, trying to block out time for writing. That time is inviolable, not to be cut across by any other things. And in this connection, Alison's recent writing retreat offered a terrific model of best practice. Number 2, trying insofar as possible, and I absolutely recognize there are key demands on ECRs in terms of core teaching provision, but try insofar as possible to match your teaching with your research in progress. At other levels, for example, can you teach what you're writing and write what you're teaching? Make your seminars work for you and vice versa. 3, anticipate what you want to write on and see if you can arrange your teaching accordingly. And I say that because I've been lucky enough to find that with great students, and we have lots of great students here at Queen's, a productive and enjoyable elective MA option is often the basis for an article or a series of articles. And I like to think that if I teach my students, I'm also taught by them. Thinking here of a wonderful MA in Shakespeare in Asia I taught just this last semester. What I wish I'd known, that it doesn't necessarily help to get too involved or too invested in a particular position, because this can be emotionally draining. Try to take each stage of an application process one day at a time. Do keep on trying. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for really great insights, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your advice there. I think if all of our speakers come back in for our Q&A, we only have about 15 minutes, but that's plenty of time to ask a few questions. Quite a few already coming in from the chat, so I'll just put those to you. The first question was about where to find mentors. Leanne and Alison have typed responses to that, and that was also something that was discussed quite a lot in the last panel, which will be recorded, so we'll come back to that question if we have time. Leanne specifically has been asked, your criteria table looks incredible. Was that something you submitted alongside the cover letter, or was it just used for your own reference?
I didn't mean to click that I would respond to that live, but yes, I do include it in the application. So I would have the cover letter, and then on the cover letter, I would say enclosure, table outlining suitability for, post or whatever it is. And then I would put it in because sure, it's handy for them whenever they're trying to do the shortlisting. So yeah.
That's great, thank you. And another anonymous question here. Thanks to everyone. How long on average do you recommend spending on tailoring a CV and a cover letter to each role you're applying for? Maybe we'll start with Sarah on that one.
I probably spent too much time. online, honestly. I find they expand so rapidly. Once you've done one for a particular subfield, that sometimes means that you've got some of your bits made, which kind of speeds the process up. You want to give yourself kind of the working, it's really hard, isn't it? A couple of days worth of proper time, but if you're spreading that out across another role, it can take, you know, if you're taking 2 hours here, 2 hours there, that can take a week or a few weeks, to be honest. It really depends what your commitments are. I don't know if the others have a better, hard or fast rule about this.
I would exactly agree with what Sarah has said. Yeah.
Yes, I'd agree as well. Start with a single solid day, you know, where you don't have any other demands on your time, to see if you can get a draft. As has been said, it does get easier because you have a model, you have a working model. So the more you do, actually, the quicker you find you execute the task.
Thank you all, that's really useful. Another quite specific question here, which I think is something that quite a lot of us have thought about. When you ask a referee, given the huge number of applications that are made by any one candidate before securing a full-time job, is it considered appropriate to ask them each time, or is that considered unnecessary? Perhaps we might start with Mark on that question.
I think it's helpful to ask your referee each time. Yes, I do, because every position will be slightly different. A referee will have on file a reference for a candidate, but you know, the referee will then tailor and adjust that reference in the light of the particular position being applied for. So yes, I think it's best practice to ask each time.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to, don't worry, you're all good. I tried to get in touch and almost provide a crib sheet of the key things the job was asking for my supervisor every single time I asked her for a reference, and similarly my other referees, partly as well because I was moving around between countries, and in a weird way I was like, well, I want to keep up contact with my mentors who are, you know, 2 continents away from me, and if I'm regularly checking in and talking to them, they know where I'm at, they know the new things I've done, and they can write the best reference for me, and I'm maintaining that connection and that network that I need.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm frantically taking notes. This is just so useful. Leanne, did you have anything to add there, or?
I just popped it in the chat. It's just that I also would, you know, send them the application, just, you know, here is what I have said makes me suitable for this post, you know, and it means they have it to hand. So it helps them to, you know, write an appropriate reference. Yeah.
Completely, yeah. Thank you. A good question from Shona, for kind of specific to the time we're living in now, I suppose. Do you have any tips for online interviews and how people might need to adapt their approach?
Oh, I had a real adventure with one of these because I was doing it from New Zealand. So I was doing everything online at that point because I couldn't keep flying back every time I was interviewing. And one evening I got to my office to do this really strange interview about, you know, God, like 7, 8 p.m. for me. And I discovered that the university had switched off the Wi-Fi for maintenance. But I had to go into this interview, so I had to toggle myself onto a little mobile phone and try and frantically be on this online interview, and it was a whole thing. I really like online interviews, if I'm honest. I think they can be quite good. The thing is just to be aware that the person, particularly if you're doing it by audio, they can't see you, so you need to think about where there are pauses and saying, let me think for a second, or that's interesting, and make sure that you're making clear that you've not been cut off and things, not rush. Yeah, those would be the kind of things I would talk about with online. I don't know what other people's experiences are though.
Yeah, my interview for this post was online, and I mean, it was the first online interview that I had done, and I mean, I did not have any specific preparation for it. I actually find the whole thing unnerving because it removed that process of, you know, arriving at the institution in your nice outfit and, you know, walking around and sort of feeling the atmosphere, and then that last minute thing of sitting in the waiting room, you know, composing yourself, where actually it was just, you know, oh, I shoved the dog out of the room and slammed the box room door, and now, you know, I'm sitting waiting and I don't know if they're letting me in. You know, it says I'm in the waiting room, you know, what's happening. I find it extremely unnerving, but it's just the times that we're living in, and you just, you know, have to throw yourself into it, you know. So that's not helpful, but, you know, that's the truth of it.
I don't have any tips for being interviewed online. I haven't been interviewed online. I've only presented online, but the same points obtain. You know, test your equipment beforehand. Test your sound. Is your volume turned up? Test where you're looking. Practice. It is a learning curve performing online. It's very different from, just talking from a teaching point of view, it's very different from teaching in a seminar and lecturing. Your gestures of necessity need to become smaller, whereas in a lecture they're more grandiloquent. So those are just distinctions between the two kind of media to bear in mind.
I mean, the nice thing about an online interview is you can have a list of stuff just off screen if you're really crafty. And if it's just by audio, you can go for a walk if you're really stressed. I remember pacing frantically up and down a flat during my Fulbright interview because I couldn't sit still, but they didn't know I was doing that. They couldn't see me, so it was fine. You know, those are nice things about it, I guess.
I would like to jump in here, actually, if I could, because I've had an online interview. Sarah, when I had a Fulbright, it was by telephone, the interview, and I was walking around as well because I was really stressed. But for online interviews, someone made a really good point yesterday that they think that presentations need to be clearer than they would in person, because they're going to mainly see the image and then your little face. And I liked the point about having something next to you. I did that for my online interviews as well. I had a presentation I had to give it. It's nice just to have a prompt, but make sure it's kind of sort of behind your computer slightly. Obviously, you'll be looking at it, and I'm not trying to say that I wasn't pretending to look at it, because it was obvious that I was looking at it, but it's less distracting than doing this. Sorry to Kate Crash.
I think an interesting point there on the reverse of that is somebody like me who's mainly done their PhD during the pandemic has sort of, my peer group is quite used to that, being able to have the notes. So maybe we need more practice with in person where we can't have that thing to rely on as well. So it's interesting to kind of find the balance of being confident with both, I suppose. And we just have one more question from Maria, who says she was wondering if you have any advice on interdisciplinary candidates applying for lectureship. So her PhD was in French, RA post was in journalism, and now doing a Leverhulme in digital media. Although she's published in all those different fields, not having much success applying for posts. So wondering if that might be related to a PhD being in a different field, and how you think she might address that in applications, to anyone who has any thoughts, really.
I think when you've got quite a unique background, because I have quite a specific first degree, right? The Scottish literature degree is a specific thing. It's important sometimes to articulate a narrative of the trip you've been on, how the things you've done go together to make a particular story. I found that helpful. The other thing, because that makes people can read you. Potentially people are getting your CV and they've never seen my original degree before ever, you know, and they go, what on earth? Or similarly, they might not have seen someone who's a PhD in French literature and who then works in sociology. So they're thinking, what? So you need to articulate a narrative of that journey for yourself. The other thing I did was I applied for a lot of funding like Fulbright and Leverhulme because I could write my own story there rather than relying on somebody else understanding. And I could keep building up a kind of a tale about what the journey was. And I can see you've already done that but that worked for me as well. I don't know about everyone else's experiences of that.
Well, I think it's a very good thing in an application letter to tell a story, and to introduce an element of the personal into the professional. I think in the case of an interdisciplinary candidate's experience, it's a plus on occasions to be able to play up and emphasize the multi-leveled or multiple nature of the profile, but do of course keep on coming back to the job specification, because that is going to be the kind of deciding factor at the end of the day when a panel looks at an application letter and a CV.
Thank you so much. I think we're coming close to the end of the panel. If I might just ask before we finish for lunch, for one sort of final top tip that you might each offer on getting the open-ended position or for interviewing. So if you could sum it up in kind of one. Sorry to put you
I wasn't expecting that being put on the spot, but I would say just to be persistent, because the posts will come up, but you might be waiting for them, or you might be reassessing your priorities. But if you're resilient and persistent, then it will eventually work out for you. It's just whether you decide before that point to opt out of this system. That's really the crux of it.
I think, Mark, sorry, Karen.
I'm sorry, I interrupted, please.
I was just going to say on that resilience point, I think it's having a really core sense of what you need in your life and what you want to be doing. I think sometimes we can get ourselves into a mindset of a job at any cost, and that's not particularly helpful. For me, it made sense to keep refining what it was I actually wanted to do, and thinking about what else I would do if that wasn't a possibility for me, and also using the support services that are available to support you through what's quite a stressful process, not being ashamed to go, oh, I need to go to a support session on this issue, or I might use the university counselling system to talk through how stressed I am. That's okay. Don't feel like, oh, I need to be so resilient and so strong and so brilliant and so positive all the time. It's hard looking for a job, and it's okay to, number one, basically put yourself first in terms of how caring for yourself,
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, I'd echo absolutely those excellent recommendations from Leanne and Sarah. And just to add to Leanne's persistent, the alliterative positive, so persistent and positive.
Thank you so much. Alison, are you on?
Oh, I was just appearing because it's the end of the panel. I don't know how to get a permanent job. I've never been employed by a university. I've always got my own funding, so I have no tips for this one. So it was great for me to learn so much from everyone.
Thank you so much to all our panelists, especially for being so generous with your advice and so honest. I think we all really appreciate that, and also to all our attendees for the discussion. And thanks also to Professor Ramona Ray and the Queen's Postdoctoral Development Centre and the QUB Research Culture Seed Fund for the support for the event. And we're coming back after lunch at 2 p.m. So people will need to go back to their email for the separate link, the separate Eventbrite invitation for Writing for Diverse Audiences, Impact and Engaged Research.
Yes, thank you very much to all our speakers and to all our attendees. Hope you all have a good lunch, and remember to get up and go for a walk if you have been sitting all morning. It's very important.
Thank
you. Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.